Here's as though we are live. Hi, everybody. Joe Moore, co-founder, CEO of Psychedelics today. Hope you're having a beautiful day so far. Today, we are hosting a virtual conference with a bunch of amazing guests. First panel here is going to be about patents. What is patentable in psychedelics? This is a big issue, hot issue, so I'm expecting some really exciting discussion here. So thank you all for being part of that one. And later, after this particular panel, we'll be hosting a panel called Eyes on Oregon, and that's going to be a fantastic one. I've been running a pretty regular bit of content around that on our YouTube channel with friend and attorney John Dennis, and it's been really great. So I'm really excited for that panel as well. Going to be a lot of depth, I believe, and exploration here. So really excited. So I'll introduce our host, Josh Mazer from Zuber Lawler. Josh, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you, Joe?
Wonderful.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm Josh Mazer. I am the chair of the intellectual property group at Zuber Lawler. My specialty is intellectual property litigation and strategy. Historically, mostly patent, but lately also a fair amount of trademark, especially in kind of the emerging technology space involving cannabis and psychedelics. So that's a brief introduction to me. Let me introduce the other members of the panel, and then I'll ask them to each say a few words about themselves. I'm not sure whether what the order is that folks are getting presented with on the screen, so I'm just going to go by the order I'm seeing. First, we have my associate, foreign attorney Radhi Shah, who is one of our rising stars, I should say, in the practice, doing a lot of work in many of the emerging areas that we're dealing with. We also have with us Malcolm Barrett Johnson, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Albert Labs. We have James Lanthier. Am I pronouncing your last name right, James?
Good enough.
Close enough. You know, as someone who gets his last name mangled frequently, I have appreciation for that. And I really do want to thank Joe for pronouncing mine right. That's rare, or at least the way I do. Anyway, so James is the CEO of Mindset Pharma. And then finally, we have Matt Emmer, who's vice president of the healthcare practice at Field Trip Health. So let's see, why don't we kind of go in reverse order of what I did? Maybe Matt, can you say a few words about you and what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually went through a recent transition. So a month ago, I was VP of healthcare practice at Field Trip Health. I'm now an advisor with Field Trip Health and currently head of development and innovation at Journey Clinical. Kind of my role within the space is really looking at how do we build out the infrastructure and how we actually deliver psychedelic assisted therapies to the actual clients and patients who will benefit from these emerging healing modalities. At Journey Clinical, we're really focused on how do we empower the individual private practice psychotherapists, so really the small businesses, so that they are able to incorporate these novel treatments into their practices. Field Trip is focused on building out actual clinics for these treatments. And as it relates to the patents, I think in both of my roles and me personally, I'm very passionate about access and how do we actually help move forward the mainstream adoption and recognition of the efficacy around psychedelic therapies, and how can patents both help move that forward while also being mindful to ensure that we don't limit innovation and access as we see the psychedelic renaissance unfold.
Thanks, Matt. And my apologies for getting your current affiliation wrong. I guess what they say is true, that this is indeed a fast-moving and fast-changing field.
It is moving very quickly.
There you go. James, please introduce yourself to the group.
Yeah, thanks, Josh, and thanks so much to Psychedelics Today and Zuber Lawler for the invitation. We really appreciate the chance to be on the panel with these other great panelists. So I'm the CEO of a company called Mindset Pharma, which is about a 3-year-old biotechnology company that was really founded with a singular focus, so on trying to develop chemically novel and optimized psychedelic medications. So to make that even simpler, we're trying to make new psychedelic drugs that do a better job, an even better job of treating these different neuropsychiatric indications than the known psychedelic drugs. And that, as I said, that was really our focus from the beginning, because our scientific founders had this point of view that, because pharma had really, for at least the last sort of 30, 40 years, had really, shied away from psychedelic drugs because of their scheduling, that there was really this sort of one-time opportunity to create, a really valuable drug discovery business, that could, hopefully design some new drugs that could address some of the shortcomings of first generation psychedelic drugs. And crucially, that if we were successful in doing that, that you'd have drugs that enjoyed full composition of matter, strong IP rights, and that this would ultimately be really valuable, because it was also the view that ultimately pharma would want to get involved in the medical psychedelic space, and would probably skip right past the first generation drugs and kind of go directly to new drugs that had real novelty associated with them. So we were one of the first groups to start filing patent applications in the space, applying a range of different drug design strategies, first to psilocybin and then to the DMT and 5-MeO DMT backbones. And out of that, we've been able to identify 4 different families of new drugs that are now covered by 9 different provisional patent applications. And I think so now Mindset is the first and really so far only psychedelic biotech company to actually form a partnership with a big pharma. So back in January, we announced a partnership with Otsuka Pharmaceuticals to advance 2 of our 4 families, towards the clinic. So that's Mindset in a nutshell, and very happy to be here.
Fantastic. Thanks, James. Malcolm, can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Josh. And again, thank you again, Psychedelics, today for inviting me. And Josh, thanks for chairing the meeting. So I'm the Chief Medical Officer of a company called Albert Labs. We've been going about 2.5 years now. We originally came out of Canada. Then we transferred part of our arrangements over to Portugal. And I'm based in the UK. And we're doing our original clinical trials and that in the UK. For a number of reasons. I'm a UK trained physician. My background is also regulatory science. So I used to work with the MHRA, the UK regulatory authorities over here. And I think the regulatory side, as well as the patent side, is very, very interesting. And that's what I think will come up later as well. Albert Labs is focused on producing a novel psilocybin. And we're going to expand that further as well going forward. And we're using mycelium-based products. So it's a biologically based product. And that produces a whole massive interesting areas in terms of patentability and regulatory authority licensability too. And we're looking for our first indication in anxiety and depression in cancer patients. I used to do oncology many years ago as well. And as I think James was saying, we're looking to push forward the boundaries of this area, because really, certainly in the depression anxiety field, the treatments we've had so far, like the SSRIs, really let us down quite badly. We haven't had many advances in this area. The SSRIs haven't got the best of safety profiles either. So it's a really, really exciting area to work in. And we go to the UK because we've got some amazing people working over here with us. The regulatory authorities in the UK are also extremely good at being very pragmatic. Although they're very similar still, although after Brexit things changed a little bit, as the European authorities are. So the regulatory side is very similar, the patentability side is very similar. And there's a lot of associations as well with the FDA as well, which I've worked with in the past too. So although we're UK based, the transferability of the patent discussions we're going to be having, indeed the licensing authority discussions as well, are very, very equitable. So very nice to meet you all, and look forward to the discussion later.
Thanks, Malcolm. And last but definitely not least, my colleague Roddy. Can you introduce yourself, Roddy?
Thanks, Josh. So hey, everybody. My name is Radhi, and I am a biochemist turned lawyer. I wanted to help the inventors who I worked with before to monopolize on their inventions, and that's where I come in. And currently working with Zuber Lawler as a foreign attorney, where I work as a patent prosecutor. I basically am involved with all aspects of patent prosecution, from filing to the grant, and after, like, what do you do with the patent that you have? Like, how do you monopolize that? How do you earn from your patent? So that's where we help. And I also am involved in helping companies with their with the FDA part of the regulations, of advising how to go about when you have to reach out to the FDA or like for the approvals. And yeah, I'm pretty excited to be on this panel with all the guests. It's going to be great. And I think one of the biggest questions that I have heard and everybody's asked me is, can you patent psychedelics? Like, because psilocybin is something, or like, you cannot patent a plant, right? So like, how do you go about this? So I think this is a great panel, and it's going to be exciting to get everybody's views on their idea of patents in psychedelics.
Maybe actually that's a great place to kick us off, is with actually the title of our session, which is what is patentable when you're talking about psychedelics. Let's see, Roddy, if you want to give kind of a general idea of it, just from the outside lawyer's perspective, that would be great.
Right. So let's start with what is a patent. Like, a basic idea is a patent gives an individual or company ownership over an invention and then prevents others from using their invention without licensing it, right? So it is not possible to patent nature, such as naturally occurring plant materials. It is possible, however, to obtain patent prosecution on isolated, synthetical or semi-synthetical produced compounds useful to ensure quality proportionate of a pharmaceutical product. Like, for example, patents encompassing synthetic routes, crystal forms, etc., with optimized pharmaceutical characteristics. That is the general overview of what is patented in this field.
Thanks. And I do want to add one little gloss on that, which is I think folks often who are not lawyers don't recognize that there's a difference between what the patent grants you is not actually a right to practice a given invention. It gives you only a right, at least under US law, a right to exclude others from using the invention. And that tends to be a critical distinction when you're talking especially about products that have at least legal questions over them, as far as whether they are legal under the various nested laws that we deal with. That can also affect remedies that are available, but certainly it's an interesting thing, because what you've got is potentially a right to prevent others from doing something that the government already wants to prevent them from doing. But that's kind of the landscape that we work in. So thank you for that great overview there, Roddy. I guess then for the folks who are actually in industry, how does IP affect the strategy and affect the way that you're thinking about the products and services that you're trying to create and bring to market? I suppose I should choose someone to start with. Why don't we start with James?
Well, it's been central, to Mindset's strategy from the very beginning. I mean, our scientific founders really had this bias that the level of the competitive barriers, you might be successful, as Compass has been, in getting a patent on a formulation of psilocybin, and others might be as well. But ultimately, the level of real competitive barriers that gives you as the patent holder is significantly less than if you're patenting a drug with a totally new active pharmaceutical ingredient. Because at the end of the day, it's not psilocybin itself that Compass is patented. It's a formulation of psilocybin, and there's really nothing that precludes others from coming along with their own formulations. And so as great as psilocybin is and first generation drugs are, and I definitely think there's a role for them. We felt like first generation drugs will fairly quickly go the route of generic, competition once you have FDA approval, and that there's a lot more defensible value to be had in drugs that are novel. Of course, the first generation drugs do a pretty good job of treating these different indications, as all the the data has shown so far. So if your mindset or your others trying to do similar stuff, novelty alone really isn't enough. You've got actually a pretty high bar to climb to try to create drugs that are that are differentiated as well, and that's been what we've been trying to do since the beginning.
So that's kind of the novel compound approach. Matt, I believe you have some thoughts about the existing compound, if you will, the legacy compound, the naturally occurring and generations of compound.
Yeah, I think kind of from my role, I'm really focused on supporting the mainstream adoption of these therapies, and as I think a lot of us are aware, part of that within our current medical paradigm and drug approval process is that it's extremely expensive to go through the FDA approval process and other regulatory processes in order to actually bring these molecules to market, whether that's a known existing psychedelic such as psilocybin, or any of the number of novel psychedelics that are being developed. And I think what's so important is that we allow for companies and organizations that are undertaking that effort to be able to do that and to be able to cover the cost and be rewarded for the tremendous amount of effort that it takes to bring these molecules to market. On the other side, I'm also very focused on, the individual practitioners and the small businesses. So how do you get these molecules into their hands and empower them to actually be able to integrate this into the work that they're doing? And similar to some of the other points being made, I think when you're looking at known psychedelic molecules, where it's more around the manufacturing process that can be patented versus novel psychedelics, where you're able to actually patent the molecule itself, there's certainly business and strategic considerations around which avenue may be preferred. I think that when looking at the end user perspective, I think it's so important that we get the known psychedelic molecules out and available to people. I also think that it's so important that we continue to innovate, because I think it's already recognized that there's going to be a large variation of different types of psychedelic molecules that might better suit individuals depending on their specific condition, and any way to be able to broaden that access and give patients and clients more options and opportunity, I think is a positive.
Gotcha. And Malcolm, how about you? How does IP play into into the work that you and your company are doing?
Yeah, Josh, thank you. I know it's absolutely crucial. It was one of the key areas for differentiation discussion when the company was formed. We're going down a route which is quite difficult in some ways when you're looking at a natural product made out of the mycelium of the actual plant itself. It makes it slightly more tricky, but it's very important though, because as James was saying, we've got basically a product there which has got its own fingerprint. It's actually it's its own product. It won't be copied very easily in that sense, And also that what that allows you to do, it allows you to manufacture that and produce that through a series of bioreactors. Effectively, it is in the same category as we would have for a pharma product, in the sense that it is a biologic. And biologics have got a number of areas of interest in terms of pharma, because if you go after a generic, you have to design basically a biosimilar. That makes it more tricky. When we were designing a system as well for actually producing this, we thought about things like bioreactors and the temperatures and pressures under which it was going to be produced. And that basically allows you to have like a stackable series of patents for the production system. So that's very important when you've got a biologic, when you've got a natural product there. That allows you to take it forward. Now, as I think we had that discussion a little bit earlier, you know, when you're also looking at this, you also have to look at the context under which it's being produced, under which it's going to be licensed, because the licensing process for natural products is very, very important. If, as James said, you have a product which can be copied, that means that someone can come along and basically nick it and nick your data effectively and take it forward. If you've got a product there which is sort of got its own fingerprint, then you come into the realms of regulatory licensing, which in itself, although it's not the patentable side, forms part of the whole, where you get more marketing authorization that allows you exclusivity for 10 or 11 years. Now that's very, very important. So it's all part of this patentability and market exclusivity, which you gain from producing a product, and data exclusivity as well. So it was incredibly important, and especially in a biological context.
And actually, I guess that kind of highlights that maybe the title of the program that we've got here is a little bit, although it's very broad, kind of unnecessarily constraining. Really, what we should be talking about is what intellectual property protections are available, or related protections are available, right? Especially when you're talking about approval processes that happen given governmental agencies, that also provides a barrier against entry by others, and a safety component as well. But particularly when we're talking about psychedelics, there is a history there and a reluctance there to move forward that is in many ways ordinarily designed to prevent harm, right, in keeping with the first do no harm principle, but can end up having an impact on the innovation as well. Let's see. So let's talk about actually then and I think Matt was starting to get into this as well. The question of basically patenting molecules versus patenting methods of treatment versus patenting methods of production. What do each of you favor, and why? And feel free to jump in. You don't have to wait for me to call on someone. Not class.
James, do you want to go first? Or
No, go ahead.
I think it's everything, Josh, to be perfectly honest. I think it's the patentability of it in terms of production methods. It is the therapy and the indication you're going for as well. So if you have an indication which allows you to use that in that area, as I said, you've got up to 11 years, certainly in the European Union, and it's similar to the FDA as well in many ways. So you've got the use of that product, the patentability of the stackable, in our case, bioreactors, how to put that together, and the market exclusivity you gain on both the market ability to use that product outside of a generic usage, and also the data exclusivity as well. So say in the European Union, if I produce a clinical trial and that produces data, I have got exclusive use of that, which you could say is a sort of patentability. It's data protection. But then you've got another 2 years of market exclusivity too. And then as you add other indications to that, you get additional years of exclusivity. So I think it's everything together. It's the stackability of your patents in terms of production, which can be many, many. And, you can have things like bioreactor design, different pressures, different ways of constructing the medicine, different formulations to some extent as well, together with how you design these clinical trials and what the indications and outputs are for the data.
I mean, no question. The more patent protection and the more patents that you have issued, as a for-profit business, the better and the stronger your position is. I think, and I know it's a great question, and I think it's one a lot of folks who are involved in the space or who are, watching it and have, strong feelings about it. Definitely, the Compass patent around some of the treatment, the physical characteristics of the psilocybin clinic treatment and the colors on the walls and the music and the stuff like that. You don't have to be an IP expert, and I'm not, to find that, pretty galling and have it feel like a real kind of, overreach. I think it's important, and definitely the lawyers can, I'm sure, support this. All kinds of patents get issued. Just because they get issued doesn't mean that they are likely to, to withstand a challenge or be, enforceable in any way. But that, I know Compass has gotten a lot of flack for that one, and rightfully so, because it all seems quite obvious, right?
Even beyond that, is it even a technical solution? And I talk about that in the perspective of, at least in the US, right? You got basically development of psychedelic technology happening now against a backdrop of a real change in our Supreme Court's approach to what is patentable. And the case law is really still shaking out about that. I actually have a case on appeal to the Federal Circuit, which is our appeals court for patent cases right now, involving nothing having to do with psychedelics, having to do with computer technology and data compression technology. But the question, for instance, of whether something is actually a technological invention, often the way that courts evaluate that is from the perspective of, if a human being can do it on their own, it's probably not technological. Whether that is, that's kind of a guidepost. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's one of the ways that, especially we look at computer software or computer related inventions. And I think as it applied to, for instance, the color of paint on the wall, by definition, that's something that a human being can do on their own. And it would be an interesting question to see whether that passes muster under U.S. law. It would be Section 101 of the Patent Act. Let's see. Matt, I don't think, did we touch on you for this? Did we give you a chance? I don't want to take away your chance to speak.
Yeah, happy to jump in here. I think that, I think patents are important in each of those three areas. I think the way to potentially think about it is patents are a tool and incentive to encourage innovation. So anything that requires a significant investment of either time or money, often requires an incentive, often in the form of a patent, in order to encourage that innovation. So in terms of patents around the manufacturing process or the formulation of known molecules, given the current scheduling, it's so important that there's incentive for companies to move those forward. So I think it's important to have patents there. Same thing with novel drug development. And then on the experience side, I think if there's true novel developments there that are proprietary, that it's important to really protect that innovation and the time and effort that someone put into that. I think it's also really important to point out that the underground community over the past number of decades, and even dating back centuries before prohibition was in place, has developed a wealth of knowledge that has really influenced and informed a lot of the developments in this space. And it's important that that's not ignored either. So you have some really, truly amazing people that have developed some amazing approaches around these treatment modalities. And due to the laws and regulations, a lot of those aren't publicly known or publicly available. And even if they aren't, I think it's important to recognize that knowledge is out there, and that should provide a guidance around what can be patented. That just because you have a company that then becomes aware of some of those practices, that a lot of them are commonly known within the underground communities. And I think that's important to recognize when you think about what can be patented around the experience and protocol side of these treatments.
Yeah, and actually, since we're now getting into the question of prior art, which is inherently a legal question, maybe I'll throw it open to Radhi. Radhi, do you see any particular prior art or background issues that apply to psychedelics in particular?
I think the biggest issue is that there are like psychedelics has been being used since a long time underground by shamans, rituals. So it's very difficult for the patent office to recognize like where, like to see if there are if there are literatures out there or there are inventions out there which have already been used. So I think as for prior art, that is the biggest challenge. And what there's one more thing that that can be challenging as well when it comes to patent prosecution per se is like a lot of patent applications have psychedelic substances in their applications, and some of them can face something called anticipation and inherency, which basically means that, let's say I saw a patent where the application is on food allergy and it has LSD being used to treat the food allergy. So this has not been proved yet, but what the problem here is that LSD can in the past may have been used for treating food allergy, right? And even though LSD might be novel to treat food allergy, it has been there in the past, so it can face anticipation by inherency. So these are some of the challenges that the patent office is seeing, and it's the patent office in US at least. They don't have the database yet to know or see what's out there, what psychedelic materials out there already being used, or how it's being used. So that would be interesting to see of how that's going to get overcome, because that is bringing in a lot of bad patents, and that is not good for the industry.
Yeah, and speaking, thanks, Roddy. That's an excellent, I think, an excellent perspective on the prosecution perspective, the patent prosecution perspective. And by the way, for those who are not familiar with patent jargon, patent prosecution is the term we use to refer to the process of actually getting a patent issued by a regulatory authority. In the U.S., it's the USPTO. It's other entities elsewhere. And Roddy, as she's mentioned, does a lot of patent prosecution. I, by contrast, do a lot of patent litigation. And my perspective on this is that it's often difficult to show invalidation, for instance, by showing public use or prior sale, right? First sale of a given product, when you're talking about something that was illegal. Unlike, for instance, trademark law, where the question of prior legal or a first legal sale becomes critical. In patent law, it's not a restriction to legal sales necessarily, but darned if you can find good documentation that establishes an illegal sale, right? That's not typically going to be the case. And you have a situation with patents and with patent litigation in particular, where corroboration becomes incredibly important. In other words, it's not enough to simply have testimony from someone, particularly if that someone has an interest in, for instance, trying to invalidate or trying to maintain the validity of a patent. You need to have corroboration by some other type of evidence, whether it's other testimony corroborating that happened, or better yet, documentation. And now that documentation is much harder to come by when you're talking about uses and products or devices, for that matter, that for whatever reason have a history of having been illegal, and therefore a history of people trying to avoid effectively creating documentation. So it does present a significant issue here, since I think we all agree that the goal shouldn't be to simply take what's already been known and been used for years or decades or millennia, and try to create a barrier to entry for others trying to use that. The goal should be to promote innovation. The goal should be to reward those who are innovative. On the other hand, you also don't want innovation for the sake of innovation that doesn't improve things. So these are interesting tensions that are present throughout the IP space, but in particular in the context of psychedelics and other kind of emerging psychoactive technologies. So that's my spiel. Sorry, that kind of, I didn't mean to stop the discussion on it, but I did want to kind of add that litigation perspective. What do we think? But actually, maybe that's a good transition to talking about the impact that patenting of whether you're talking about treatment methodologies or production methodologies or, for that matter, molecules. What kind of impact is that going to have on the delivery of psychedelic therapies? It's especially in the kind of psychiatric space. I throw it open.
Well, Josh, it will obviously limit it, because as you were saying, the trouble is, if you've got that in place, you're absolutely right. You don't want to limit the use of things which have been around for millennia or hundreds of years or from the 1960s or whatever. But unfortunately, that of course limits industry coming in. If you're trying to get monies in from venture capital people, they're going to say, okay, well, why is this going to be special? And that's going to be very limited.
Show me your barriers to entry. Yeah,
absolutely, and that's a big problem. So. It is an issue, and I think I know it's probably slightly different to the European market to maybe the United States market, but over here that's a huge issue. And I suppose one issue that I would love to have some clarity on is as well, and I don't know because patents isn't necessarily my speciality, is this global? Say we had in America, you had certain techniques or certain things from shaman that were being used. It wasn't common in the European Union. Would that patentability be applicable in the European Union, or say in Australia or other parts of the world? That would be an interesting point of discussion.
Yeah, and that's going to be dependent in large part on whatever the governing patent law is in that jurisdiction, and it varies from place to place. Yeah. I don't have section 102 and 103 of the Patent Act in front of me at the moment, of the U.S. Patent Act in front of me at the moment, but I will say there are distinctions among the different categories as to whether the prior use in question need be domestic or whether it can be anywhere in the world.
I tend to think it's to your question, Josh, it's more going to be, the utility of the drugs that drives, their adoption, and we'll continue to draw in, more investment. So as the first generation drugs get approved, regardless of what rights what IP rights exist on their manufacturer or on different indications or not, we all of us who are close to, watch the data know that, or have a high level of confidence that the drugs, are going to do a really good job, or at least a better job than the current treatments for, not only treatment-resistant depression or PTSD, but probably like a much wider range of indications. And one thing we know about like the pharma space is if something, works, it invites all kinds of copycat, competition. And so I think, look, it feels, it doesn't feel right to see groups try to patent stuff that's been around for decades, whether that's in the underground or it's just simply, knowledge that's, quite, self-evident. But I tend to think at the end of the day that those rights holders will just find a lot of competition if the treatments are successful, and are going to have a hard time, policing, their rights, because other groups will set up, if it's treating using LSD to treat a food allergy, someone will figure out, a workaround pretty quickly. And so I don't really think it'll necessarily limit the growth of the overall psychedelic medicine space. I could be wrong. Maybe that's overly hopeful, but I just think you'll see a lot of competition pretty quickly once, you have FDA approval for psilocybin and for MDMA.
And in fact, from the legal landscape, I should also add, at least the U.S. legal landscape, one interesting thing that happens when you're talking about FDA approval is that once you have FDA approval for a given indication, treating physicians are not limited to using a given compound for that indication. It's kind of an interesting aspect of U.S. law. And I don't know that that's internationally applicable, but under U.S. law, at least the fact that basically once you get the door open a crack, it opens it wide,
Right.
which creates opportunities. It also creates, I think, probably some understandable reluctance on the part of regulatory authorities because they are concerned that if they allow this little wedge in, the door's open.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Josh. It applies in the UK and across Europe too. So as a physician, I can prescribe, once it's got a license, in other areas as well. If I decide to go and prescribe morphine for your headache, it'd be a pretty stupid thing for me to do as a doctor, but I could do it. And so you're right. It allows that door to be opened. Of course, you have to take account of the safety profiles, but it does. And that's why I think the regulatory side is a area for discussion together with the patency, because as James said, it won't stop another group coming in once you've got that door open with the FDA or the MEA, and then taking that forward and trying again another product in a similar space. The indications and the clinical use of it is what drives its use and drives the commercial uptake by other companies as well. It always has and always will, and that's something we can learn a lot from, and we do from pharma.
Yeah, I'd agree with that point that, the patents are so important, especially on the drug development side, which I think has been a focus in the psychedelic space overall. And I think something that I've had conversations about is, the fact that the psychedelic treatment experience, is a lot more than, only the psychedelic molecules. So we're at the stage right now where, there's such an effort to just get those molecules available to people so that they can start working with them. But, what I've seen both at Journey Clinical and I was at Field Trip is there are many different other therapeutic modalities that complement the psychedelic molecules themselves really beautifully. And that, that can really influence, the outcomes and the efficacy. So when we're thinking about patents, if we're trying to support innovation but avoid exploitation, I think that exploitation can go both directions, where if there are common therapeutic practices and then there's one company that's trying to patent those, that's potentially exploitive. But likewise, if there's, a team that puts in a lot of effort to really develop something that's truly novel, and then that's being copied and taken away from them, that's also exploitive. So I think it's really interesting to, as we have this conversation, keep in mind that, I think a lot of the focus has been on the molecules themselves, but there's so much more to psychedelic assisted therapy than just the molecules. I think I really like to emphasize that it tends to be an active treatment process that really involves the active engagement of the clients and patients that are going through these treatments. And it's, important to really think about, who's facilitating and developing, the approaches and protocols that, facilitate that flow and movement through the treatment experience.
And that's a great point. And I think, I'm obviously probably biased, but I tend to think that, the molecules and the rights around them also help drive the investment in the treatment methodologies and the trial and error and all the work that, Matt and others are doing to figure out, what the right ways are to conduct, psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And I think, that's at a basic level why IP rights, are important. I think, that this kind of argument that, well, MAPS has been able to really carry the ball without, IP rights. MAPS has done, incredible work, but I think, we're also here, in part thanks to the work that Compass has done, and they're a for-profit, privately funded, company, and I think, without all that kind of formation of capital behind psilocybin and behind now the new, drug discovery efforts, we don't also get the capital, lining up to create the clinic infrastructure and do the work to figure out what that piece needs to look like. So, the patents are important.
Yeah, I'd agree. And even MAPS, they still have IP rights, and that's held by a public benefit corporation that then is owned by the nonprofit. But they're even recognizing that, MDMA won't be free, and by charging for MDMA, it will support the broader work that MAPS is doing. So they're also looking at the IP rights that they will have as well.
And adding my patent litigation perspective in here, I should mention a lot of folks don't know about this, or at least a lot of non-lawyers and non-patent litigators don't know about this. But there's actually, again, U.S. patent law, because we litigate in given jurisdictions, and that's my focus. There is what's called basically there's an exception for being able to assert infringement against treating physicians for following a patented method of treatment. In other words, you can't go with even if you get a patent on a particular method of treatment using, for instance, psilocybin. Under U.S. law, you cannot go after an individual practitioner who is using that method. You could conceivably, and actually this has rarely been tested by the courts, it's a very strange portion of the statute, leading us to suggest that perhaps the legislators who proposed it and were thinking about it and voted on it may have been indulging in a bit of psychedelics themselves. But I don't think Orrin Hatch would have been involved in that. But that being as it may, it's not really clear what this exception means. There was very little legislative history. There was essentially a debate between two different senators on the floor of the Senate. It's the only references to it, and they took diametrically opposed views of what the legislation actually meant, leading us with very little in the way of guidance as to how to apply this, how to apply the treating physician exception, including whether, because a treating physician has at least cannot be gone against, right? Cannot be sued for practicing a given patented method. What about those who assist, either by providing information or by providing the tools, namely the psychedelics themselves? Can those people be gone against under the patent laws for damages or for an injunction that would prevent them from helping physicians do something that they do now under U.S. law have a right to do? They're open questions that haven't really been addressed in any significant way yet, but I suspect that they will be by someone over the coming years.
Josh, that's very, very interesting, actually, isn't it? I think as a prescribing physician, I'm very, very heartened by that. I think if I was pursued for prescribing or doing a therapeutic treatment for, I'd be a bit miffed, actually, for that. So,
sure. And unlike many other, very specific provisions of law, it came about because there was an instance in which a treating physician was in fact sued and the suit was successful. I believe the suit was successful, and that created a desire on the part of the legislature to try to correct that, to try to make sure that physicians weren't having to defend themselves against patent suits simply for practicing medicine. That said, it also, I think, illustrates the problem of creating statutes to deal with precise fact situations that have come up, and to try to address them and not really recognize how more edge cases might apply. Ooh, what is that ding?
It's probably telling us we're really close to the end.
Oh,
so
okay.
I want to make sure we hit a couple questions from the audience.
Oh, okay? Sure. Yeah, I have not been monitoring the questions, Joe. If you have,
I'll go ahead and read some.
Just read the really good ones, though, please.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to rank them. I'll start with the first one I see. First one here. Where would one patent treatments with substances which are still that's not going to fly for me right now, sorry. Can you describe the process of turning an idea into a patent, specifically around like drug discovery here? Like, this is kind of maybe a little too high level, but maybe somebody could just take a really quick stab at that one. So for instance, like Compass. So like the idea is let's go ahead and get some patents because we want to push this thing through. We want to have some protection for our investors. Our IP is critical to our investor strategy and execution strategy. So like maybe anybody want to speculate on that or any kind of stories out there? It's okay if we need to pass on that one.
So I can take this, I guess. So what we usually do is, it obviously depends case by case, where you got to see what is your invention exactly, what is your molecule, do you want to patent the molecule, are you looking to patent a formulation, etc. So you cannot patent an idea per se, right? So you have to, like, in the drug industry, we see if it's a formulation or the development of the drug, or like, is it novel or is it innovative? So that's usually how, like, you go about deciding if you can put in your application or not. So there's nothing patentable like an idea in US under the USPTO. But yeah, I work with inventors every day, and we sit down and we see, like, okay, so these are the things. This is, yeah, sure, you have the molecule, it's already out there, but this is innovative. This is what you're trying to put extra. This is what brings, like, X and Y brings the result Z. So the Z is what we patent, right? So on a very general, basic level, this is how you go about deciding if you want to patent or not.
Great. Thank you for that. Next one here. This one is again Compass specific. They're kind of the punching bag for everybody that's interested in being.
And that's probably a good
patents.
opportunity for me to say that the opinions expressed by especially Rati and me are our own opinions, not the opinions of Zuber Lawler, and not the opinions of any of our clients. I think that also applies not the opinions of our companies to the rest of the panelists. And I always like to add an additional disclaimer, which is, the additional lawyer's disclaimer, which is, if this had been legal advice, it would be followed by a bill.
In some of my shows, I say, whose lawyer are you? The answer is nobody's, unless you paid me and I've agreed. All right, next up here. How likely is Compass to be granted a patent on holding hands, soft lighting, and soft furniture during therapeutic sessions? Is there precedent for patents being granted for things that are this obvious? Because this is part of the whole tradition. My understanding is, and this is a preface, is this was part of describing how their patent was going to be used, and not really with any intention of excluding other people from holding hands.
Fortunately, I haven't read the Compass patent, and so I can take it out to a level of abstraction beyond that. Again, I think it comes down, when you're talking about human interactions, simply human interactions without a technological component to them, that's unlikely to be upheld as a patentable invention in a court if it's going to be enforced. And one nice thing about the patentability, basically about the challenges to patentability, is that in most courts in the US these days, that is a question that it can be addressed at the threshold of the case before there's even an answer filed, which means that we're not taking the time that we need to get to whether it's obvious or anticipated, which are, again, terms of patentee art, or patent terms of art, to meaning anticipated means the entire invention is pre-existing, and obvious is that maybe the entire invention isn't pre-existing, but once you knew what the prior art was, you would obviously go and do what the patent is calling for.
And I think it's pertinent to note here that this is just an application. There's a lot of things that go through between an application and a grant. There are a lot of, like, when you're applying for a patent, your application is your claims are different than what you get a grant on, because what usually applicants do is they put a broad claim out there and they let the examiners decide what goes through and what does not. So in the end, there might be a very different patent which would not have all these aspects or all these claims, and would not even have such a broad claim. So in terms of Compass, it's just an application. We still have to see what the examiner would allow and will not. So.
But is that generally the case then? You chuck as much stuff at the wall and see how much it will stick, or is that sort of condemned as not being a very good way of practicing?
it is a good practice, I would say, because you want to claim as much as you can, and maybe sometimes it sticks and you get a grant on that, right? So usually the patent practitioners do let you have broad claims. They apply for broad. It obviously depends case by case. So as for Compass, yeah, it is controversial because should their attorneys have provided such broad claims, because this is general, like holding hands, general, like, so it is pretty controversial. But good practice or bad practice, I think it depends. They usually do apply for broad claims.
And again, I think this comes back to remembering that patents, despite I think a lot of common misconceptions, are really just rights to exclude. So it's not necessarily saying you're going to practice in that area. You're just trying to stop others from practicing in that area. And it can actually end up being you end up in some interesting situations where there can inevitably patentable inventions happen within a scope of an unpatentable prior art or a patentable prior art. So you can have a situation where you got a relatively broad patent that was already issued to one company, and then you can have a narrow patent that basically deals with only a subsection. If you think about a Venn diagram of invention here, a small portion of it, and although the person who gets, or the company that gets that smaller patent that's subsumed within the larger one, doesn't have a right to practice it, neither does the company that had the larger one. In other words, you can prevent someone from practicing something that is within the scope of their patent by getting an additional patented invention within it. These are the angels that dance on the head of my pin.
Well, they're a game of chess up here, doesn't it? Really? God.
Quite.
Yeah.
Joe, do we have more questions that merit coming to the top of the food chain?
Anything about IP? I don't think so. I think we might be good for now. So let's thank everybody, and then we will have time to chat for about a half an hour in rooms before we kick off the next session. Josh,
fantastic. In that case, I want to thank all the panelists. I think this was, frankly, the process of leading up to this and also the process of doing this today, I think, gives you an idea of how to scratch the surface of what's a very, very deep question that, frankly, that the answers are not necessarily clear about yet, but hopefully will become more clear over the coming years. So thank you, all of you, Matt, James, Malcolm, Roddy. It's been a delight to get to do this with you, and looking forward to talking with you further. And there you go. And so I guess now we're jumping into individual virtual little tables.
All right.
Thank you, Josh, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. We'll see y'all in a little bit. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much.